Hello all, I'm Kel Kidman and welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today we are going to begin with Jen Psaki defending the kids in cages, using a whole lot of euphemisms in this case, talking about how, oh no, they're not being kept in cages, they're in facilities that we're using, overflow facilities you might even say, that are just like summer camp, you know? It's like they're in summer camp. There's lots of space for them to run around and play around. There's playgrounds and all that sort of stuff. They're not in cages. Oh, really? They're in cages, huh? Okay. So, let's move back a bit. Let's go back to 2017, when this controversy was happening before, under the auspices of Donald Trump. And let's see what their response was then. Oh, it was the exact same. Because it turns out these buildings are not new. These buildings that look like camps, that look like completely normal summer camps, that are holding illegal migrant children in them, yeah. They didn't just pop into existence just in the past 2 months. No. They've existed for years. They've probably existed before the Trump administration, long before then. Because it turns out that we don't actually keep the kids in cages. It turns out, actually, that the argument that children were being kept in cages all throughout this time, and that it was a great tragedy of human rights, was a lie. Wow. And it's really fun to see that sort of thing happen, except now the defense is coming from the left, and in this case, Joe Biden and Jen Psaki. It's not exactly surprising, and of course, it's not something that's untrue, and I'm not going to criticize them for making that defense, as it is an accurate defense. But I will criticize them for the hypocrisy of having criticized Trump for doing something that he didn't do. For putting kids in cages, which is not something which was an accurate depiction of what was going on anyway. And for all of the pictures that actually were with kids in cages, those were literally temporary facilities where they were in for like 24 to 76 hours. They were in there for a few days at most, and then they were moved to the more playground, school camp sort of looking areas. Because that's how we treat children in America. Shock and horror, guys. It's really fun to see that, though, and I'm very happy to see them coming around to sort of the sanity of all of this. Now, moving on to our next story, we have, a wonderful rundown analysis from The Atlantic, where they're saying, here's the most likely timeline for life to return to normal. And they're talking essentially about, don't expect to take off masks until 2022, and they're going all the way to spring 2022, and all of this sort of stuff. They're expecting, essentially, by spring and summer to 2022 to have life be normal again. But they're saying things like, in spring, we're actually expecting cases to go up, and we're basing this on nothing. They're basing it on nothing. They're saying that in spring, the cases are going to suddenly pop up to the stratosphere, as opposed to what's been happening over the past few weeks, with cases dropping for a myriad of reasons, partially due to vaccines and the higher distribution of such, and also partially due to the fact that they've changed the way they're actually doing tests. Both of those, I believe, are factors. And they're saying that this trend is going to completely reverse itself in spring, despite the fact that in spring, at least presumably, considering seasonality of diseases like this, is going to be a much better time for the virus to not be spreading than it would be in kind of the middle of winter that we are now. I don't know why they're considering it this way, especially when we're talking about in spring and much later on to that point, having 100 million doses of the vaccine being administered at that point, which is, by the way, something that's not going to be due to Biden, because they're not actually increasing the amount that's being done every day. They're just continuing what was going on in the Trump administration. But other people have covered that better, so I'm not really going to cover it here. But this rundown, and I really think you guys should read it, because it is just so silly. So, going on to what they're saying about about what they're saying about summer 2021. They're saying, oh, some people are less optimistic, and they're essentially saying, oh, we're still going to have masks and such. It's still talking about these sorts of things, and of course they're following a lot of the experts' guidance on this sort of stuff, which of course is not actually based on evidence, but rather their own suppositions of what is going to happen in the future. And if we know anything about expert suppositions of what's going to happen in the future, it's that they're always wrong. So there's that. I think that's that for that kind of rundown of what this whole article was. But to talk about more what I would expect or what I want to see going forward into the future is at some point, when we get to the point where the amount of vaccines that have been distributed far eclipses the number of cases that have at least been detected in the United States. And we've already, I believe, passed the point where we have more vaccines and more vaccines administered than we actually have cases. Like, it was 26 million, and that was like a week or two ago. We've already passed that point. Once we get to the point where there's 100 million vaccines have been distributed, and there's only like still around 26, 27 million cases, I don't see the reason that we should continue to do restrictions at all. Because at that point, we're so much dwarfing the sort of virus in terms of vaccines that there's no reason for us to be shut down, because in all likelihood, you either A, already had it, or B, you have a vaccine. So I don't get this sort of thing, especially when we're talking about, by that point, by the time we have 100 million vaccines administered, at that point, everyone who's actually vulnerable to this sort of stuff is going to be vaccinated by that point. That is substantially more than the population of over 60 people in this country. That is substantially more than the amount of people who are morbidly obese in this country. It's an extremely large subset of the population. And the rest of the population can deal with the very slight risk that comes with COVID-19 existing. So I don't see the reason why we need to be talking about, we need to talk about fall of 2021 or next year even, about how we're still going to have masks on and we're still going to be doing social distancing, because by that point it's going to be completely ridiculous. By August, we're going to have more doses in this country than there are people. Right? We're going to have 300, more than that. It was so many more by August, dude. Just going based on the rate that we're at right now. And there's no reason for that to expect that to slow down by any metric. Like, there's no reason to assume that would slow down. So by August, we're talking everyone being vaccinated, but Fauci and people who are experts, apparently unable to do basic math, still wants to keep masks on until the next year. Utterly ridiculous. And it really doesn't help their case when it comes to vaccines. I mean, I'm not intent on getting one. I'm probably not going to, just because I don't see the risk of myself getting COVID-19. Though I would suggest that certain people in my family actually do, because, well, they're at more risk than I am. But I don't feel the need to. The same reason I don't get a flu vaccine every year. It's not something I'm particularly worried about. That's how that is. Moving on, however, to our next story. Illinois is going to end cash bail, and oh boy, that's going to be fun. Yeah, because remember when New York did this? I mean, they're going to be the first state to do this. But New York City, remember when they did that? Remember how well that went? You remember how many repeat offenders just came out of the woodwork after cash bail was completely eliminated? As if a mirage. As if they came out of the blue, out of nowhere. There's no explanation. No. Don't look into the fact that they would have been kept on cash bail and they wouldn't have been able to get out of prison to do their repeat offenses. No. Don't talk about that. Now, I have my qualms with certain aspects of cash bail when it is used in order to keep people who they're pretty sure aren't actually involved, or people who don't have any, particular need for a repeat offense, or there is no evidence that they would do a repeat offense. Keeping them in with cash bail isn't very logical to me, especially before their trial, before we actually know that they're guilty. However, that should be on a case-by-case basis. Eliminating cash bail entirely, all that does is it takes the guy who was literally caught in the act doing it, by police as he was doing it, like a bank robbery or something. A guy who's been arrested like 10 times for similar crimes, with robbery, theft, and that sort of stuff. And it puts that guy out on the street again. What do you expect to happen other than repeat offenses in that case? Now, that is not all cases. That is just a hypothetical case that may apply sometimes and does, in fact, apply sometimes, but not in every case. In some cases, take someone like Kyle Rittenhouse. Kyle Rittenhouse, you have no reason to believe, as the judge or the prosecutor or the government in this case, that he would actually commit anything again. The circumstances under which the supposed crime was committed were very particular. They only happened that one time when he was in that particular circumstances. And so long as you have other bond requirements that limit him from being in those sorts of circumstances, he'll be totally fine. So I think it's reasonable to at least put limits on cash bail, and in which cases it can be applied. However, eliminating it entirely is stupid, especially since cash bail is a good deterrent towards repeat offenses if it gets matched, because it's an actual collateral thing. You're actually giving something to the government that you may get back if you win your case, but you don't get it back if you lose, or if you violate that bail, violate bond. That's a pretty reasonable assumption in that case. There is use for collateral. And in particular cases where you expect repeat offenses, if they are let out on bond, cash bail is entirely reasonable. Entirely reasonable. So that's kind of my argument on that case. And obviously this isn't going to end well, as has been obviously seen from New York City. I'm amazed that they are taking on this provably failing policy in New York. Illinois is one of the worst states for crime in the union, as well as New York. It's insane to me. I don't know how they came to the conclusion that was reasonable. Does not make sense. And another thing that doesn't make sense, or a whole lot of sense, an ex-Capitol Police chief is going in front of Congress, testifying about what was happening on January 6th, and there's a whole lot of hubbub about this. And he's blaming this whole thing and the failure of the response, particularly in the case of January 6th, on an intel failure, essentially saying that we had no intel, talking about, these people, insurrectionists, as he describes them, armed insurrectionists, as he calls them. We had no intel on indicating that they would be there or they would be violent. And I have problems with this account. It's, first of all, long and meandering, and there's plenty of pandering and other nonsense that doesn't actually give any information in his actual statement. However, luckily for me, it was split up into paragraphs, so, there would be a paragraph or two of pandering and nonsense and things that don't need to be said, and then there would be like a paragraph or two of information, which is very useful to me to know where I could just skip a paragraph and not read it, or just skim over it, and what paragraphs I actually needed to read. So that was nice. I quite liked it. But there's a bit of a language thing I wanted to talk about with regard to this guy's statement, because he kept saying that they were armed insurrectionists. Over and over again, I saw throughout this, armed insurrectionists, armed rioters, all sorts of things. But the problem I come at this with is the idea that these guys were armed. Because as far as I can see, no one was armed. I mean, unless you consider them having arms to be somehow constituting them being armed with some sort of violent weapon. To me, it seems as though no one was carrying a firearm at all, or if they were, it was concealed and never came out. The only gunfire that was ever shot at this protest and riot was by the police at protesters. And I'm not talking rubber bullets, I'm talking live rounds. I think there's something to be said there. All right, these people were not armed. But for some reason, this guy characterizes them over and over again as armed insurrectionists. I don't get it. I mean, unless you're going to consider... I have not seen any evidence of them being armed with any sort of lethal weapon, much less firearms. I haven't even seen them having knives or things like that. You know, and knives aren't even necessarily a self-defense carry type of thing. I carry around a knife almost everywhere I go, not because I want to defend myself, though that could be potential use. It's never come up, though. It's because I want to open boxes or something like that, because sometimes you need a knife. So, and I haven't even seen that. So I don't know how this guy gets away with saying, oh, these guys are armed, because I have never seen anything to that effect. And it's telling of how this sort of thing has been treated and how these people have been characterizing this riot and this trespassing. It is telling that they are willing to push it as far as pretty much lying about the makeup of the protesters and rioters that were there. Because they weren't armed. I don't know how else to say it. They weren't. I think that's enough. There are other things he says in this, but the actual premise that there was an intel failure is kind of based around the idea that the protesters are armed, one, and two, that this was extensively planned in beforehand. Both of which I find a bit strenuous as claims. First of all, they weren't armed, so and they didn't expect them to be armed in the intel report. So that was an accurate representation. That was accurate intelligence. And two, it doesn't seem to be planned. It seemed a very spur of the moment, especially when you see the videos of people initially breaking down the barricades, and it seems as though the police are just kind of letting them through. It doesn't seem to me as though much of this was planned. So, I don't know. I don't know why this guy is characterizing it this way, but it seems to me to be inaccurate. That's all I'm going to say about that. And I think that's where I'm going to leave you guys off today. If you liked the video, share it around and subscribe for more wherever you are, you know. And unless you're on YouTube, in which case, subscribe literally anywhere else. There are many pretty links down below that point you to wherever else I put my videos regularly and irregularly. And also, it points you to places like Minds, Gab, and Parler. All of which are places that I like to sometimes post my random thoughts as well as putting up my videos as links there. I quite like doing that. And that's where I'm going to leave you guys today. I'm Kel Kidman, this has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.